Hello and welcome back to part 7 of my Resident Evil retrospective series. Today we're going to be looking at one of the most influential and significant games in the entire Resident Evil franchise, and possibly in video games in general, Resident Evil 4. In any long-running video game series, there's always a turning point, whether it's a series that's slowly gone from good to bad, or fresh and exciting to stale and tired. Whatever it might be, there's always a game you can point to and say, this was the one. This was the moment when everything changed. Well, in that case, our game is Resident Evil 4. Quite simply, it redefined what a Resident Evil game could be, changing the focus and theme of the series and taking it in an entirely new direction from that point onward. Whether or not those changes were for the better is still a hotly debated topic amongst Resident Evil fans, so in the course of this video, I'll do my best to outline the main issues at play, my take on them, and what they meant for the series as a whole. Hopefully by the end you'll be in a better position to make up your own minds. But first, let's talk about how Resident Evil 4 came to be. In my previous video, I mentioned that Resident Evil 0 had one of the toughest and most protracted development periods in the whole series, but holy crap, it's got nothing on Resident Evil 4. This game went through no fewer than 4 scrapped versions before finally settling on the finished product. For the sake of our collective sanity, I'll do my best to summarise the main events here without making this video about 2 hours long. Ready? Good, let's get into this. Resident Evil 4 was originally conceived back in 1999 as a direct sequel to Resident Evil Nemesis, intended for release on the upcoming PlayStation 2. Resident Evil 2 director Hideki Kamiya was brought back in again to handle the game's production and decided to take the series in a new direction, instructing his dev team to come up with a cool and stylish action game. The story was based around a new character called Tony, a man with superhuman skills and abilities brought about through the use of nanotechnology. The pre-rendered backgrounds from previous games were ditched in favour of a dynamic camera system so that combat could be fast-paced and intense, and the environments were heavily based around Gothic themes and architecture. The team even travelled around Europe photographing cathedrals and other ancient buildings to get just the right look. Development proceeded throughout 2000, however, Shinji Mikami wasn't impressed. He liked the game overall but felt it didn't really fit within the Resident Evil universe. He gradually convinced the dev team to make it an independent game, which naturally didn't go over well with Kamiya. The two men had clashed heavily during the development of Resident Evil 2 and still didn't get along with each other. Still, Kamiya eventually rewrote the story to set it in a world of demons and supernatural monsters, changed the hero's name to Dante and the title to Devil May Cry, which eventually spawned a hugely successful franchise all of its own. So, big wins all round then. With Devil May Cry out of the way, work on Resident Evil 4 restarted in late 2001, and it was announced for the GameCube the following year as part of Capcom's exclusivity deal with Nintendo. This second version, commonly known as the Fog version, was directed by Hiroshi Shibata and was about 40% complete at the time. The game featured Leon S. Kennedy from Resident Evil 2 infiltrating Umbrella's main headquarters in Europe and used traditional Resident Evil monsters like zombies and dogs. During the course of the story, Leon becomes infected with the progenitor virus, which grants him special powers. The game also featured an unnamed female co-star and first-person gameplay elements. A second variation of this game was revealed at E3 2003, known as the Hookman version. During Mikami's presentation, he commented that development on the game was proceeding smoothly and that it would be scarier than before, warning gamers, "Don't pee your pants." Okay. The story was set in a haunted building where Leon contracts a disease and fights paranormal enemies like suits of armour, living dolls and a ghost-like man armed with a hook that follows him around. The game had an otherworldly feel, making heavy use of flashbacks and hallucinations. It also used gameplay mechanics that would make it into the final version, like the over-the-shoulder camera, a laser sight for aiming in battles, and quick-time events. This game would also feature a playable female character, who would wake up deep in Umbrella's lab and try to escape the facility, accompanied by a controllable zombie dog. She would eventually encounter Leon, and the pair would join forces to find a way out. Although it was an atmospheric game that borrowed heavily from Silent Hill, the paranormal elements were totally at odds with Resident Evil's core concepts. Realising the game was likely to alienate fans, Mikami himself stepped in to terminate production. Shibata and his team were humiliated by this failure. Frustrated and burned out, they'd make one last attempt to create a game more in line with the Resident Evil formula, keeping Leon Kennedy and the dynamic camera system but reverting to standard enemies like zombies and hunters. This fourth iteration was deemed too predictable and lacking in creativity, and it was discontinued before a playable version had even been developed. Needless to say, morale at Capcom was on the floor after so many failures and cancellations. Everybody wanted to make Resident Evil 4, but nobody seemed to know how to do it. It was at this point that Mikami himself stepped in to take direct control of the game. Mikami had taken note of the lackluster sales of the previous two RE games on the GameCube and concluded that the series' core theme of survival horror had become stale and boring. He was determined to move more towards fast-paced action and big set pieces. This change of direction severely polarised Capcom's dev team, with some staff excited to break away from what they saw as a tired formula, and others depressed that they were selling out and abandoning what had made their games unique. Mikami pressed ahead regardless, altering the camera system to take the camera behind the player character, introduced QuickTime events during gameplay and cutscenes, and a new type of enemy called Ganados, which were faster, more dangerous and intelligent than the zombies of previous games. Great emphasis was placed on action and movement, with the player often forced to fight hordes of enemies through large open areas that they could approach from multiple directions, even climbing up buildings and leaping across rooftops to escape pursuit. An expanded array of weapons and explosive items allowed for more destructive combat, and legacy character Ada Wong was introduced in a similar role to Resident Evil 2, helping to better tie the game in with previous games. After a torturous production period, 4 scrapped versions and nearly 6 years of development, Resident Evil 4 was finally released in January 2005 on GameCube. Despite their existing agreement with Nintendo, Capcom decided that Resident Evil 4 didn't fall under the terms of their exclusivity deal and ported it to the far more popular and successful PlayStation 2 later in the year, guaranteeing strong sales. When you take into account HD remasters and additional ports to other systems, Resident Evil 4 ultimately went on to sell 7.8 million copies worldwide, making it one of the most successful video games of all time. It was also met with universal acclaim, with critics praising the fast-paced action, graphics, control scheme and tense atmosphere. Many cited it as the best in the entire series, and possibly one of the greatest video games of all time. But was it really? Well, let's look at it in more detail. The plot picks up 6 years after the events of Resident Evil 2 with Leon Kennedy, who now works as a Special Forces operative for the US government. When the President's daughter Ashley is kidnapped by a mysterious cult operating from a remote region of Spain, Leon is sent in to rescue her. The locals seem to have been infected with some kind of mind-controlling parasite and prove to be decidedly unfriendly, and after a bit of a tussle with the village leader, Leon is captured and imprisoned with another man named Louis Serra. Leon's mission from here on is to break out with Serra, find and rescue Ashley, and put a stop to head bad guy Osmond Sadler's plan to seize control of the world. Just another day at the office then. Whatever problems Resident Evil 4 might have, and I'll be sure to talk about them later, there are a lot of things this game gets right. First up, the new control scheme and camera layout is simply brilliant. Much as I was a fan of the pre-rendered backgrounds of the original games, it was clear by the mid-2000s that they'd come to the end of their road. Being able to properly explore your environments in full 3D and look in any direction is a godsend during the more frantic combat sections, and believe me, there's plenty of them in this game. The first big set-piece confrontation in the village is a masterstroke of building tension, followed by a desperate action-packed battle to stay alive. Crowds of crazed, slavering villagers come at you from every direction, wielding pitchforks, clubs and flaming torches, and in some cases even swinging chainsaws. These aren't the mindless zombies of the past that you could easily outwit or outrun. Every time you think you've outsmarted this game, it shatters your expectations. Try to run and they'll follow you. Barricade yourself into a building and they'll break through the windows. Climb onto a rooftop and they'll scale it with ladders. Draw down on them and they'll dodge aside before you can pull the trigger. Survival has changed and you need to adapt quickly to survive the new world of Resident Evil. The combat mechanics themselves are smooth, fluid and intelligently implemented. The laser sight system allows for accurate and precise shooting without becoming intrusive, and most importantly, it feels believable. Damage detection is also fully realised. Shoot an enemy in the leg and they'll go down temporarily. Shoot them in the head and you might just blow it clean off. Tackle them at the edge of a rooftop and they'll fall to their deaths. Shoot a Ganado just as he's about to hurl a Molotov cocktail your way and it'll explode in his hands, showering his surroundings with flaming gasoline. If you're particularly sharp, you can even shoot objects out of the air as they're hurtling towards you. This is a gaming experience that thrives on creativity, quick thinking and improvisation. Whereas other Resident Evil games quickly fell into a familiar rhythm with their combat, no two battles are ever quite the same in RE4. The intensity of the combat is helped immensely by the graphics, which are quite simply stunning. For a game that came out more than a decade ago on the GameCube, RE4 still looks incredible today, with sharp textures, complex and imaginative environments, excellent use of dynamic lighting and volumetric fog, and wonderfully realised character models. Although if I was to be super critical, I might mention that the colour palette isn't exactly varied. What level did you like the most? The brown village, the greyish brown castle, or the brown island facility? Anyway, inventory management has been given a major upgrade. Items are now carried in a briefcase based on a simple but effective grid system, with weapons and equipment now taking up space roughly appropriate to their size and shape. While this does force you to play Tetris with the case's contents to some extent, it does eliminate the problems of previous games where a drawer key would take up the same amount of space as a rocket launcher. Upgrades purchased from a mysterious merchant throughout the game can give you more carry space, more powerful weapons and better healing items, giving the game an RPG element. As I mentioned, this is a new game with a new breed of enemies. Other Resident Evil games have tinkered with new threats for you to face, whether it's the Crimson Heads of the remake, the Leechmen of Zero, or those weird arm things from Code Veronica, but this is the first one where it really feels like the rug has been pulled out from under you. The Ganados, your main enemies in this game, are human villagers infected with mind-controlling parasites, retaining some of their intelligence and able to use primitive weapons. Whereas before you could keep your distance and pick your enemies off from afar, now you can find pitchforks, flaming torches and crossbow bolts hurled your way. Blow their heads off and a tentacle parasite might suddenly erupt from their neck, giving you an even more dangerous enemy to deal with. At some points later in the game you'll even find yourself going up against suits of armour with parasites lurking inside. Boss battles are taken to a whole new level here, whether it's fighting against a mutated salamander while trying to cross a lake, a cave troll that can throw boulders at you, or a giant mutated parasite merged with the body of one of your enemies. Whatever it might be, RE4 consistently pushes its game engine to the absolute limit to give you an experience like nothing that had come before it. So where does it go wrong? Well, despite all the gushing I've just done, it would be wrong to say that I don't have any criticisms of Resident Evil 4. First and foremost is a simple one. This really doesn't feel like a Resident Evil game. There are no zombies, no T-Virus, no Umbrella Corporation, and very little to tie it into the rest of the series. Yeah, Leon Kennedy's back, but he's such a radically different character now that he might as well have been given a different name. Albert Wesker is mentioned on occasion, but like with Zero, he doesn't play a direct role in the story. Ada Wong is probably the main callback to RE2, once again filling in the role of mysterious spy slash femme fatale, and while she's become a fan favourite for many people over the years, I've always found her a pretty difficult character to connect with. She gives nothing away, so she encourages no response from the player. And I guess that's my issue here. Strip away the occasional references to other RE characters and events, and you're basically left with a generic action horror story about bad guys planning to infect and take control of the world, albeit a very enjoyable one. The characters are a bit of an issue too. Ashley is a whiny, useless MacGuffin who really can't do anything by herself. You keep rescuing her from various contrived scenarios, but it never seems to last for long. And the sections where you have to escort her are frustrating in the extreme as you watch her blunder straight into another group of enemies and get hacked to pieces for the 10th time. Rounding out the good guys is Luis Serra, the mysterious Spaniard. See? Anyway, Luis is a former researcher on the last Plagueis parasite that's infected everyone in the area. After turning against his former masters, he joins you as a reluctant ally. Since most of the characters are pretty stereotypical in this game, Luis is a smooth-talking, gun-toting ladies' man who dresses like a matador and is always on hand with a bad pun or two. Although it is kind of funny if you accidentally shoot him enough during combat and he'll gun you down in response. At least he does it with style though.
Adios, Leon.
Osmond Sadler, the big bad guy of the game, just looks too ridiculous to take seriously. He's obviously based on cult leaders, but it's really not got much to him. And as for Salazar, the not so big bad guy, well...
Mr. Kennedy, don't you know when it's time to throw in the towel?
Oh, make it stop. I mean, just look at this guy. Who actually thought this character was a good idea? Jack Krauser at least makes for a decent villain, even though he's not in it for very long. A former Special Forces operative presumed killed, he's more than a match for Leon in combat, even if the game makes rather heavy use of QuickTime events during their encounters. Another questionable decision is setting the game in Spain of all places. Granted, Capcom are a Japanese company, so maybe they see southern European countries as impoverished, primitive backwaters, but I think they went a bit over the score here. I've toured Spain a couple of times, and while there certainly are remote areas with more traditional cultures, the villages depicted here look like they came straight out of the 17th century. It'd be like setting their next game in Scotland and having the locals living in mud huts and attacking each other with claymore swords. So where does this leave us with Resident Evil 4? Well, I guess for me it represents both the best and worst that the series has to offer. Its graphics, gaming style and combat were revolutionary, delivering gaming experiences that have stuck with me long after I completed it. More than that, the game is quite simply fun. Fun enough to encourage repeated play, and varied enough that no battle or encounter ever feels quite the same as another. However, it also represents the first major step away from the core themes of survival horror that made Resident Evil what it was. The massive critical and commercial success of this game would only reinforce Shinji Mikami's belief that action and combat were the only way forward, leading Capcom even further down a path that would result in major problems later on, ultimately requiring another massive reinvention of the series to get it back on track. But that, as they say, is a story for another day. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you found it informative and interesting. Please feel free to share your thoughts on this game and on my retrospective in general in the comments section, and do consider hitting like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. Join me in part 8, where we'll find out what happens when Capcom venture even further down the rabbit hole with Resident Evil 5.